Okay, we are running. Let's see what's. Just bring this over to here. See how we're doing. It's still waiting for me. Defaults. Okay, now it's playing mute. And why did this not go to default mute? Thank you. Okay. So hello. How are you? Okay, so for those of you who have who do not follow my website, let me switch. No, that's not screen. Hang on, sorry. Okay. Those of you who don't watch, don't read my website, BW Media Spotlight, bwspotlight.com. I have tonight just completed a multi-part review of the book Seduction of the Innocent. Just make this camera. It's not. Sorry, this is not. There we go. There we go. Now we're right. Now we look good. Now I'm centered. So anyway, this thing pop out. Seduction of the Innocent. What's going on? Innocent was a book that came out in the 1950s, right as comics were starting to get popular, and it was something that was very much enjoyed by a lot of people, but because it was a brand new medium, it had a whole new way of being written, of being read. There were just a case where a lot of people took issue with it. One of the biggest was Dr. Fredric. Sorry, things are distracting me here. I don't do these too often. Anyway, the biggest the person who was most upset by comics apparently was one Dr. Fredric Wertham. He was a clinical psychiatrist at the Lafargue Clinic in New York, and his big thing was he really did not like. Well, no, sorry. His big thing was he worked a lot with truants and petty theft and kids who got into fights and all the other stuff. And he was also seems to be a very cultured man, someone who's a fan of culture and classic literature. And I love books. I mean, the article series that I reviewed Seduction Innocent in is called Chapter by Chapter, where I read a book one chapter at a time and review how it flows from one chapter. It's kind of like a read-along book club of sorts. So I mean, I love books, but he looked at comics and he did not like them. They didn't read like books. They didn't look like books. He did not like. He thought sequential art was ugly, even the stuff that we would think is good. He thought it was ugly because it didn't look like regular artwork. Because it's sequential art. Sequential art has to be. Sorry, got something in my nose. Sequential art has to be done a certain way because in order to make the story flow. I've reviewed a number of comics where they used what I call the painted art style, which is pretty obvious from the name. And sometimes the art can be really good, but it's not very good sequential art. There's kind of a difference. I'll probably may or may not get into that. Anyway, he was very outspoken about comics. He said that comics were leading kids away from literature, and if that had been his only complaint, whatever. But he was also convinced that comics were like basically they were a negative influence on kids. And I just mean comics altogether. He wrote off, the further you dig into this book, the more you realize he was writing off comics altogether. The entire was being looked at negatively by him. So he testified against comics. He tried to get laws to restrict comics to kids. And then he wrote his infamous book, Seduction of the Innocent. It was released in 1955. And so research probably went as far as 1954 before he started writing it. Basically, it was a book where he took all the time he could to try to prove that comics were bad. And this, of course, had a very negative impact on comics. On the plus side, it kind of led to the comics code. On the negative side, it led to the comics code. I'll get into that. But it caused just a huge backlash against comics and really kind of restricted the media for years, And because basically the thought was comics are for kids, they're not for grown-ups. I mean, we see that with animation, we've seen that with video games. That's kind of one of the reasons why I want to get into this book. Is I've heard all the boogeyman stories, the Seduction of the Innocent did this and did that. He's the reason they killed off Alfred, gave Batman Robin girlfriends, so they wouldn't think they were gay. And yeah, we'll get into that too. And I heard that the book was bad for comics. It did this and that. So I wanted to read it for myself. I wanted to see if it was as bad as I kept hearing about it. Because it's one thing to hear about it. It's something completely different to know firsthand just how bad it actually was. And it turned out it was actually a lot worse than I've heard. Yeah, imagine that. This was actually worse than I'd ever heard about this thing. And here's some of the problems I had with it. One for me was he took every pop shot he could at Superman. He said Superman was fascist, he represented Nazi ideals, despite the fact that he'd been created by two Jewish men a decade before Hitler was ever a factor. But whatever. He also took shots at Wonder Woman and Jungle Comics and characters like Sheena. Basically, he didn't like any stories where women stood up and fought the fight against evil. Basically, he didn't like any comic stories where there was fights against good and evil. He immediately assumed that kids were immediately going to sympathize with the bad guys and become evil, which is really a stupid thing to figure. I don't necessarily think that Wertham was a bad person. Well, at least I didn't until I got to the last chapter. If you read the book, the part I just posted tonight, which if you're watching this on my website when it posts would be yesterday. But I did the final part a few hours ago and went up. And yeah, he was kind of bad. He was equating his war to protect kids from comics to child labor laws. He treated comics like he talked about comics like they were a deadly disease, and he was always talking about mental hygiene. And there's just a lot of things that he said that would rub anybody who knows comics the wrong way. I don't think there were times that I wasn't sure he understood storytelling. There were times I wasn't sure he understood comics. And it was just so many different things wrong. Let me just go through some of the things that I thought Wertham was right about. So when I do my comic reviews, I always try to say, here's what they got right, here's what they got wrong. So here's what Wertham got right. It's a very short list. He complained about depiction of racial characters, and he was right about that. Comics back then, I mean, it wasn't until a 1960s cowboy comic called Lobo, not to be confused with the DC character. This was a story of a black cowboy in the Old West. It was the first time that a black character had gotten his own comic. And while I haven't read it, I kind of assume, from what I've heard, that he was a decently depicted character. Plus, by the 1960s, you started to get less characters of black people. In the 1950s, the best you could hope for was somebody like Ebony White or Whitewash Jones, which were still horrible racist depictions, but at the same time, we're loyal and good friends and caring and fought evil and all that stuff. So, I mean, based on that, it was a good. That was the best you could hope for. So he didn't like that there were a lot of black characters being written like the bad guys. To me, it's more of a case of not that there were black villains, but that there weren't as many black heroes. There were many good guys of color. And if you were, like I said, you got Ebony White or Whitewash Jones. Whitewash Jones was probably the worst because he was just drawn horribly too compared to everybody else. But that was all you were going to get back then. So on that angle, yeah, he was right. He also talked about the way Asian people, they used to call them Oriental back then because they came from the Orient. But I may end up using that word again. I know it's considered racist nowadays, but yeah, Asian characters, of course, were always poorly depicted. They were colored completely yellow, which is not even accurate. But nobody was drawing black people as if they were, that's right, this color black, because that's not the case. And she got moved again. Okay. And white people don't look, this color white. But somehow, Asian characters were always made this color yellow. And that was definitely a mistake. And I mean, I not so much defend as understand the way they were treated. Or Asian characters were written culturally, because we didn't know anything about them back then. Things were different back then, and this was before the war or during the war, where we were at war for them because they attacked us, and that's a whole other discussion about the war. But yeah, the racist the Asian characters were written badly. They were very what we'd call racialized today, but even by their standards, I think maybe it wasn't always fair. So yeah, I mean, that was one thing that he got right. I don't know what else he got right. That's how bad he botched a lot of this. Okay, here's where he was partially right. I will admit that media storytelling can influence somebody to a degree, which is, in one way, it's kind of a good storytelling. On the other hand, it also shows how storytelling can be misused to lie to people and trick people. And media is very powerful. Storytelling is a very powerful way of getting messages out. Science fiction is beautiful at that, for better or for worse at times, but sometimes it doesn't sink in. I mean, famously, H.G. Wells wrote a story where he was talking about the atomic bomb. So when somebody actually went and created the atomic bomb, they named it after his book, not realizing he was telling people, don't make this. Don't make this. Don't make this. Hey, we just made this, and we're going to name it after you because you inspired me. You idiots, you got the wrong message. That was kind of a big deal. But, I mean, that's kind of the power of storytelling. So to say that media has no influence on anybody is kind of stupid. However, I think actually, I know he overplayed it, and I'll get to that. I think he overstated media's influence because, I mean, I grew up with comics. I grew up with loving parents. I grew up with a conscience. I grew up with an understanding of right and wrong. So I didn't have any trouble. Was it because I got post-comic code comics? According to Wertham, the comics code didn't go far enough. No, I actually did another article series called Breaking the Comics Code. And in there, I kind of examined the comics codes. So there were some things that were good if you were saying, this is what it takes to make a comic for kids. But there were other things that were stupid no matter what age group you were targeting. And that was kind of the fault of this book, was they got a lot of more parents angry at comics. It got them to force government to try to do something about it, and so their solution, comic industry solution, was to come up with the comics code and the comics code authority. And of course, the problem was that the comics code guy writing the comics code was simply using it to strike out at his publishing rival at EC Comics, which did mostly horror comics and crime comics. And then the general public and all the parent groups got together and kind of forced every seller out there. If you sell a comic that doesn't have the CCA logo on it, and nowadays, comics do not have the comics code brought because the CCA basically didn't know what they were doing, and they said, "Look, we can't decide. We have to play games with you in order to get the story we want told." Probably the most famous one is the whole women in refrigerators trope, where Kyle Rayner comes home and finds his girlfriend dismembered in his refrigerator. And the CCA said, well, you can't show the dismemberment. You put the refrigerator door in front of it so we can't see it. No problem at all with her being dismembered and stuffed in the refrigerator. We just can't see it. What? And of course, there were times when the government itself went to comics and said, hey, we want to do this anti-drug story. And the CCA said, no, you're depicting drugs. We can't do it. It was just the depiction of drugs that got them upset. It was just the depiction of drugs that would get Wertham upset. I mean, one of the books that he came off on was something called Teenage Dope Slaves. And with a title like that, I had to look it up. And I reviewed it, and yeah, there is nothing in that comic that's going to turn kids on to drugs. The whole story is about a kid crashing on drugs, everybody dumping on him. Only his girlfriend and comic strip character Rex Morgan, MD, who was the focal character of the story, they were the only ones on his side. Except maybe the cop wanted to bust some of the most sadistic drug dealers you've met, and then all of a sudden they're on drugs. Yeah, this was not a story that was going to get kids hooked on drugs at all. And it was also things like he thought the Blue Beetle was was a hero who actually turned into a beetle, because he didn't understand when the kid was telling him that the hero turns into a beetle. Maybe he didn't understood less than he thought, or maybe he did understand. I was just reading an article a little before I started the stream. There's a woman named Carol Tilley, and I'm going to use that as tomorrow's morning article link, so you guys can read this yourself. After Wertham had died in 1981, his records that were used to create Seduction of the Innocent were sent to the Library of Congress. And she went, and when they were made public in 2010, and she wanted to find all of these supposed letters that librarians had written, talking about how bad comics were and how they were drawing away people from the libraries and all that. She didn't find that many, but what she did find were some of his records that kind of indicated Wertham was full of crap. He would combine stories, and he would leave things out. Two examples that I noticed. One was the whole Batman was the Batman Robin are gay thing. He apparently had interviewed this one kid who was caught having relations with another boy. What he left out is not only was this kid not into Batman, really into Batman Robin, he was more into Superman and war stories, but this kid was also molested by this other kid. So you know, I mean, whatever you think of homosexuality as a whole, in this kid's case, it was the result of, you know, being sexually assaulted. And he left that part out, of course. And this is the time when homosexuality was considered a bad thing. But he wanted to make it look like Batman Robin turned this kid gay. And, you know, he also tried to use Jungle comics for that, to make that point, too. All these Jungle comics, these big muscular men were turning kids gay. And, you know, Sheena was emasculating men. And all this other stuff. Actually like. She also found out that he would often there were times that he would take something said by a group as a whole, probably members of his hooky club, which is a group of truants and minor criminals that he brought together to kind of discuss things, which was not a bad idea. There's something else he was right about. It was a good idea. And he said that he would sometimes take something that the group had said and put it all on one kid to make it look like this one kid was really messed up, instead of just little kids with a bunch of kids with some minor issues. And sometimes he would do the opposite. He would take something said by one kid and make it sound like the group, to make it seem like the group was messed up. Ever would make comics seem the worst. That's what he went with. And he just had no understanding of comics, of storytelling. He was focused on kids in the inner city. So talk about, well, this book is selling knives to kids. Well, there are some kids in some areas, and not everybody was using knives to attack people. He was complaining about a knife set because he claims that a bunch of kids were buying, you know, a knife set like you'd have in the kitchen and using them as weapons. Which, you know, and the more you read some of this book, the more you started to suspect on your own some of the things that he said. And it turned out he, you know, there's more to suspect than you thought. Hang on. There was a lot of things that he was just outright lying about. There's stuff that you could tell he was exaggerating. You could tell stories that didn't make a whole lot of sense. And he was also trying to make comics a causation. And I'm reading it, I'm wondering, how many of these stories is he writing that he says were caused by kids reading a lot of comics? And how of them were simply kids are reading a lot of comics, but they're doing these bad things? I don't think you can claim cause and effect all the time. Because I mean, we know people who have taken part in like violent video games. Wertham's successor, Jack Thompson, going after the newest media format. Because every time you come up with something new, there's always somebody's they're gonna laugh it off. Then they're gonna look at it and they're gonna say, well, wait a minute, what is this doing to our kids? They don't understand it themselves. And they will go after it and target it and treat it like it's this horrible thing because they don't understand it. And they're assuming that this new media has to be for kids. It's what comics went through, it's what television was able to avoid, because it at least could say, well, we're like theater, movies. In fact, one of the kids that Wertham claimed was into it for the comics, according to the notes that Tilley went through, he was actually blaming movies for why he was committing these robberies. So, he always tried to express it with comics, and then in one chapter, he tried to point to television, but he said television was being influenced by crime comics. Everything was bad because of comics. Every bad thing he could point to they possibly could, was because crime comics were a bad influence. He's talked about letters, and I would love to see if she ever found these, that she conversations that he had with actual comic writers and said, well, we're being restrained because the publisher insists we have to write all you violent stuff, and we're not getting to write the stories we want. But then in the last chapter, he's talking about that comics have freedom. Well, which is it? Are the writers being restrained, or the writers have freedom? And I kind of question that. I think a lot of people didn't want to admit they wrote comics was because comics were treated as this horrible corrupting medium, or treated as this media for kids, and media for kids always looks bad. Or something looks bad. It happened to Power Rangers. It happened to video games, and it's going to happen again. And this, my friends, as horrible as this book is, as jerkish as Wertham comes off, especially in the last chapter when he's trying to equate his war on comics with the war to create child labor laws. Despite all of the attacks that he made on Superman, I mean, the stuff you hear about Batman and Robin is one corner of one chapter and then pops up every now and then, because Wertham loved to beat the same things into your head over and over. But if someone asked me, should I read this book? I would say, yes, you should. You should also research, look for the article by Carol Tilley about how flawed his research was and how badly he botched or lied about comics or made them look bad. And here's the reason you need to check when I think you really should read this book. As bad as you may think it is, as bad as Wertham thinks it is, as horrible as you think it is, the reason you should read this book is the same reason I should blow my nose or something, is the same reason I chose to read this book. Because it's so bad. Because it's so insulting. Because it derives a medium that was just getting started, that was just fresh, that was finding its own voice. It was a whole new way of telling comics, of telling stories, Complain about word balloons. He complained about the sequential art. He complained about the sound effects. This was a whole new way of telling a story, just like a video game had to find its own way of telling a story. Some of them seem to be trying to imitate movies, because the live action movies seem to be the pinnacle. If you're not a live action movie, you haven't reached the top. To find its own way to tell a story, to convince people how to read that and to follow, and to be able to tell his own story. One of the stories in the last chapter that he complained about was something called shock suspense stories. And according to Wikipedia, it was actually a comic that was speaking on social issues. One story he mentioned was one on police corruption, and a story about corrupt cops. And the thing is, the writer, according to Wikipedia, was trying to tell people about corrupt police officials. And that was kind of the point of the story. It wasn't to glorify violence, to say, hey, this is a bad thing. And this is something that comics can do well, something science fiction does very well, like I was saying. But the reason you need to read this book is because it'll happen again. It has happened again. It happened with Jack Thompson. It happened with Power Rangers. It probably happened with Ninja Turtles. It's always going to come up that these arguments are going to be made, that this or that new medium is going to corrupt kids, or it's wrong, or it's not very good, or it's not what I grew up with, so it's immediately bad. And don't think that our generation, if somebody comes up with a brand new medium, that our generation wouldn't do that. Because it happens and you may not do that. I wouldn't do that, because maybe something won't be to my taste. Not everybody's into video games. Not everybody's into comics. Not everybody's into books. Not everybody's into whatever's out there. Some people, I happen to be drawn to anything that tells a good story. Some people only like certain things, and that's fine. But anytime something new comes up, these arguments are going to come up. It did. Jack Thompson was the next Dr. Wertham. And somewhere out in the future, some whole new media format's going to be created. And you know that there's going to be a new Jack Thompson who's going to come out and complain about that medium the way Jack Thompson was the next Fredric Wertham. So reading this book is important to know these arguments. Research, like I said, look at Carol Tilley and look at her research to show just how off he was, the things he got wrong. Because they're going to get that wrong again. Thompson did that with video games. Hillary Clinton did that with video games. And, how do you deal with it? Comics did it wrong. It created the comics code. Video games did it right. It created the ESRB rating system. Go under the MPAA rating system. Comics, television, movies, video games would make it so much easier on us if we all had the same rating systems that we all know, that we're all perfectly familiar with. It would be so much easier. That way you would know which comics or which video games are not kid-friendly, what TV shows they shouldn't be watching. And I also encourage parents to actually pay attention to what your children are watching and reading. I mean, you can't pay attention to all of it, but if you can catch some things, you can catch some of the good things, and you can sit down with your kid and say, why do you like this? What about this draws you? Teach this as a teaching moment for the kids, but also a teaching moment for you. And learn. And that's what Seduction of the Innocent should be, a teaching moment to say, what are the arguments being made against this brand new media format? Am I seeing it again? Maybe when I knew Wertham was wrong about comics, I know Jack Thompson was wrong about video games, maybe I better make sure that I'm not wrong about this new medium. We'll learn more about it. Maybe it won't be my kind of thing, but if I understand it, then I know better how to choose what my kids are watching. And I think that's really a good message to take away from this book. So yeah, I do encourage people to read it. As horrible as this book is, as annoying as Wertham is, knowing what he was saying, knowing what he was doing after the fact, will help you to better protect your medium of choice when it comes under attack, whether it's comics or video games or cartoons or whatever else comes along. So yeah, I think it is actually very important to study Seduction of the Innocent, to study what Jack Thompson was saying, and Fredric Wertham, and whoever else. And whether going after a show, Doctor Who went through it, Power Rangers went through it, or an entire medium like comics and video games. Understanding what your opponents are saying, instead of just angrily writing them off, will make it easier for you to defend the media, to defend something that you love, to defend something that you enjoy. And then look at some of these questions and say, okay, maybe I enjoy this. Maybe this isn't something a 5-year-old should be watching. But who's to say that I can't keep watching it? I can't keep playing it. I can't keep reading it. And why are they writing off an entire medium when there are these good things, good games and comics and television for kids to watch, read, and play? And I think that understanding would make it a lot easier to defend your medium, any new mediums, new media that come out in the future. That's why it's important to read this book. That's to understand these kind of arguments, to make sure you're not making them yourself, and to understand and being able to note some things they may have been right about. On the other hand, to be able to counter some of the stuff where they're completely off. So I was kind of hoping people would show up. They never do. I can't seem to get audience participation involved in these things. And that's one of the things I need to work on, is get audience participation involved and commenting on the things that are my commentaries and my reviews. But that didn't happen today. And this here, if any of you read this after the fact, thank you for taking the time to watch this. I hope you found something interesting. Feel free to comment. I would love to know what other people's opinions are on this. And hopefully I can start doing some more video content as things start down, and I can don't need the air conditioner on to basically survive up here, and I can start doing some more video content. And also, now that I still have some healing to do. I'm not like 100%, but I'm certainly strong enough that I can start working on more projects. But I also got to find some kind of income fast. I hope you found this interesting. I hope I will put a link to the category for Seduction of the Innocent in the comments, and maybe a card, so that you guys can check out my article series on Seduction of the Innocent and my article series on breaking the comics code, and try to understand where these people were coming from. As wrong as they were, understand that they did come from a place of actual concern about what kids are being exposed to. It's just they didn't understand it, and they immediately wrote it off as something bad, which was not beneficial to the industry at all. But feel free to enjoy comics. I love comics. I love books. I love movies. I love TV. I love video games. I love audio dramas. I just enjoy a good story is where you find it, and I will always search for a good story. With that, I wish you good night. I wish you good luck. And thanks for taking the time to listen to this. If you do later. Good night.